The GMC Hummer EV, this nearly 9,000-pound super truck that produces 1,000 horsepower, nearly 1,200 foot-pounds of torque, is GM's new EV flagship truck. And this was the first vehicle introduced on the Ultium platform. And this is going to be a deep dive video on the engineering that goes into this product. We had full engineering support from GM's engineering team, and we are going to try to explain to you what they did and how they accomplished it. And even if you are not a Hummer fan or are particularly interested in this vehicle, hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of all of the engineering that goes into products like this, as you are definitely going to see a lot of the subsystems in this vehicle make their way into other GM products. Before we head into the shop and put the Hummer EV on the lift, I thought it was important we discuss the interior and exterior of this vehicle. This truck had to be a convertible or slash targa top. It had to have a frunk and a usable bed, while also looking like a badass off-roader. So if you look at this from a design perspective, at least an exterior design perspective, this looks like a cartoon character in the best way possible. It oozes almost childlike charisma, and if the reaction of the public is any indication of their success, the Hummer EV design team has done an excellent job. When it comes to the usability of this truck, you have a 5-foot bed with the GMC patented multi-pro tailgate, which effectively increases the usable area of the bed space and all the tie downs that you would want in a pickup truck. And you have the frunk. You have a front trunk in this vehicle, and it is large enough to store all of the targa top panels. So if you Tetris them in there, you don't have to leave them behind. You can also use it as a trunk for your groceries you don't want banging around either in the cabin or the bed. The interior space of this vehicle also had to balance all of those same design compromises. So they had to make this feel expensive. They had to also make it feel ruggedized, because it is an off-road vehicle, so it couldn't have materials that would get damaged by dirt or by direct sunlight that easily, while also looking like a futuristic vehicle. And the design theme they went with is space or lunar themed. So a lot of the design cues are supposed to make you feel like this futuristic spaceship vehicle. And I think they've done a good job. They took a fairly minimalist approach with material colors, and I think they've done it to great success. The use of bronze through this cabin makes it look unique. There's interesting geometry, and I like the contrast colors of white and black. They've also maintained the truck usability, so they didn't alienate those buyers. The rear space in this crew cab truck is enormous. Your passengers could be 800 pounds and fit back there, and it's a jump seat style, so you can push the rear seats up if you want more storage space behind you. They also maintained all the usability of a truck as well. So you have giant door pockets, you have a cubby below the center armrest and center console area, you have a giant center cubby, giant pockets everywhere. It's this big, usable truck experience. And all of the controls, whether it be your window controls, your steering wheel controls, your shift or your drive mode controls, or your HVAC controls, all traditional and physical. GM hasn't gone and screwed that up. It still can be used as a traditional truck, so there isn't a giant learning curve to get into this vehicle. The general ergonomics of the front cabin, again, much like the rear. You can be a 7-foot tall person or a 5'1" person and fit in this car. The seat has a wide range of adjustability, there's a lot of headroom, and a ton of glass. Despite the high belt line in this vehicle, you have really surprisingly good visibility. You just have to be comfortable looking down at all the people below you in this thing, because that's the general experience. This thing is enormous. Lastly, let's talk about interior technology, because that was another big showcase piece for GMC in this Hummer EV. The first thing to talk about is you have Super Cruise, at least in this Edition 1, which is GM's hands-free driving assistant. Then you have these two giant display panels. You have your infotainment display, which is like a 13.4, 13.3 inch display. It runs the Unreal Engine for graphics. It is running Android Automotive software on the back end. So it has Google Assistant, it has Android Auto, Apple CarPlay. It works very well. And it has the ability to be OTA updates. So any of the weird software hiccups or bugs that I've experienced hopefully will no longer be in this vehicle in a couple months or years. The other thing to talk about, of course, is all of the graphical displays. Again, to wow their customers, they've put a lot of effort into making this feel like an experience when you drive this thing. So as you go through this dial drive mode controller, you'll see animated drive modes. Those were done by the Epic Games team, and it adds something in this vehicle. Obviously you have all the off-road functions as well, like crab mode, which when you activate vibrates your seat. And lastly, you have about 1,000 cameras on this thing, so you can see underneath the vehicle when you're off-roading. You have a 360 camera, you have a trailer cam. This vehicle has the ability to both wow you with all of its technology while also feeling mostly accessible. And that is not the easiest task to accomplish. My only real con with this thing, other than the typical off-road ruggedized audio system, which is average at best, is this really cheap feeling paddle on the steering wheel for brake regen. I don't know why it's there and why it feels so cheap. But past that, I think it's time for us to head in the shop and put this thing up on the lift.
The GMC Hummer, and there is a lot to talk about in terms of engineering, Jack. And I will say this right up front, Jack has spent an insane amount of time on the technical side of this video, from talking to engineers, the real people that design this, the forward and back with the questions and answers and trying to get this right, because this is really a next generation vehicle. So when a lot of our viewers, half of them complain, oh, you're not technical enough, and then you're too technical. The thing is with something like this is we want to try to address a lot of this technology and explain how it works. Whether you like this particular product or not, like I would never buy a Hummer, but the technology behind it applies to me, because in 5, 6, 10 years, almost every single product from GM and maybe other partner brands are going to carry over a lot of this. So understanding how it works is very helpful for the future of all EVs and a lot of these cars with electromechanical systems that are all driven by CALs or software. So when GM came up with this, we'll start with the story part. The upper management, we're talking like executive management.
Mary Barra, Mark Royce, the bigwigs at GM.
They wanted to do this in response, and they didn't say this, but it was exactly the same time that Elon Musk announced that he wanted to do a truck, and it was a very basic render of a truck. And we know that Tesla has caused ripples in the industry, whether you believe in what Elon Musk, if you're one of his cultish followers. There's a lot that that brand has done to kickstart things like this in other electric cars and change of ideology of what a car should be. So GM got right on it. They're like, we're not going to be last to the game in making a truck. This is our playing field. What they wound up having to do is something that they never did before. Accelerated development, accelerated engineering to bring this to market in a record amount of time. That means spinning up a factory, retooling a factory, coming up with all the technology, and having to, they said it multiple times in their development video, something they had to do in less than half the amount of time than a traditional product. They wanted to get this to market. It was critical to their business. And in some cases, you can see it's miraculous what they did here from a technology perspective, that they got it done. Yes. And Tesla still has not even, like it's still vaporware. So yep. They did everything they possibly could do. It's a whole, people's entire careers led up to making this.
And they didn't just pick people who worked on EVs. The chief engineer, Al Oppenheiser, is a big sports car guy. He did 5th and 6th gen Camaro, which makes his transition into the EV trucks world more challenging. And if you watch their documentary, he had some reservations to say the least, but at least they got enthusiasts or people who were very well respected within the organization to work on a product like this. And GM has given me time with Tim, who's in charge of the Ultium electric propulsion system or the Ultium architecture on this vehicle, and Aaron, who was kind enough to answer my 10 million development questions. So let's start with body structure first, because what's unique about the Ultium platform vehicles is it's not a unibody and it's a not body on frame vehicle. So like in a traditional truck, say a Suburban, it's on T1X or T1XX, which is a ladder chassis vehicle, and most of the body rigidity comes from the ladder chassis. This is on BT1, which is their truck architecture, but it's also on Ultium. It's using the Ultium battery packs along with the body structure and suspension of the BT1 platform to give this vehicle its rigidity. So one of the first development goals of this vehicle, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, is it had to be a convertible. They wanted an open top off-roader. So if you know anything about what convertible structures do to body structures, they make them far more flaccid or less rigid. So the joy of Ultium, the battery pack, is it adds an unbelievable amount of body rigidity. All the modules underneath this essentially act as a giant spine, along with, of course, all the body structure improvements they had to do to BT1 or this specific body structure.
And this was not something they wanted, so they knew right up front that it couldn't just be like a recycled Hummer from the past. It's not a truck, it's a recreation of a truck. And when you cut through a lot of the nauseating marketing that they're trying to spin, and you cut that out and you get right down to the engineering, this had to be like revolutionary in terms of what the truck industry was doing. So they're not taking everything that was done before. They've literally redeveloped the chassis, the suspension, the electromechanical systems, the propulsion system. This is all new for what's going to go in the future of trucks.
This had to not alienate traditional truck buyers. So if you got into this and you had no idea it was an EV for some reason, you could go drive this around and pound it around off-road and have a very minimal learning curve. And at the same time, it also had to appeal to EV people. So it's a difficult compromise to make.
I think that's the most difficult part about this thing, is because it has to do so much. It's trying to be a convertible. It's got to be an SUV. And to be clear, this is the SUV and the truck are identical in terms of design.
Other than like wheelbase, yeah.
Right. So they had to do all of these things. It had to crab walk. It had to go off-road. It has to somewhat tow. It has to be good on-road. That means there's compromises in what they choose for suspension, tire design, the interior. It has to be like waterproof for the audio system. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of shit that they had to pile in here. So it wasn't just focused on one thing. They had to maximize their ability in engineering, not only to take it from this, but to take it to the Denali's, to the future electric vehicles. So it was critical that they got all this, or close to being right.
All of this has to be modular. BT1 is going to be their architecture. You're going to see used in EV Suburbans and EV Silverados. Then Ultium, which this is the first vehicle that's on their EV architecture, is also modular. But I think it's important we hear from Tim, who's essentially the subject matter expert on the Ultium propulsion system.
When you think about what's happening in automotive, in 2016 we came out with a very affordable practical Bolt EV. And that chemistry was great for the time. Now here in 2022, we basically reduced some of the problem elements in there. Cobalt is down by 70%. We've got a format specifically designed for the car, and we reduced the cost down 40%. But we're just getting going. We've got future plans to say do even better than this, and you got a couple choices now. You can keep this volume there with higher energy density and get more range. Or for the same range, you can take out some of those cell module assemblies I was talking about and just have it be very customer selectable, customer choice. You got to start off with what is the primary purpose of the vehicle. And I always start with energy density and watt hours per liter, okay? Of course you want to have the highest watt hours per liter, but it has to last the life of the vehicle and beyond. And so that's kind of the balance that you do to say, well, you push the tech. We're at 620 watt hours per liter in Ultium today. We've talked about getting up to 1,200 watt hours per liter. And so then they can have some of those choices. And then once you have that, you say, well, I got to have that to move the lithium, to get the power, to get the torque. How do I integrate it with the chassis so that I can have all that structure work together at a minimum weight factor? Yeah, so I mentioned those 24 cells go into that cell module assembly. And that's got a liquid cooling plate integrated into it. And with the heat pump, you can take the stored thermal energy you had in the battery and use it for cabin comfort. So you can imagine in the wintertime, you got a battery and you're charging it, you precondition it so it's maybe 5 degrees warmer than it was. Now you take all that thermal mass and with the heat pump, you pump it in to the cabin. Now, there's a lot of advantages there where on a regular resistive heater to make heat, it's kind of a one-to-one because you're going from electricity to BTUs or watts, actual heat, and that's 1 kilowatt in, 1 kilowatt out, pretty good efficiency. When you're actually just moving the heat from the battery pack to the passenger compartment, it's called the coefficient of performance. Because you're moving it 1 kilowatt into the heat pump gives you 5 kilowatts out. And that fundamental physics really gives you the advantage to say, I can really improve cold weather range because I'm not using the electrons to propel the vehicle, I'm using the thermal energy in it. And that's one of the unique things. Now, to make all that happen, you need the heat pump, but you also need the control system to manage it. And you can kind of imagine that, you know, a common thing with heat pumps is their coefficient of performance goes way down in the cold. Well, you can put the drive unit on the same loop and take that waste heat to precondition that loop so it's at a very efficient point for the heat pump. Take the heat you used to dump overboard, you know, liquid to air heat exchanger, put it into the heat pump, have the heat pump be more efficient, and get back to managing that cabin.
So as Tim explained, Ultium is a propulsion system. It is a modular set of electric motors and battery packs. This is the biggest case that they can possibly do for something like this. It has a 246 kilowatt hour battery with 212 of that being usable. It is 24 modules, two 12-pack modules stacked on top of one another. The entire weight of the battery pack is near 3,000 pounds, so more than a small compact car.
And that's including the cells, the packs, and of the casing, correct?
Yes, so when you watch this thing get manufactured, as you're gonna see in some B-roll, the pack is lifted into the body. So essentially Ultium is lifted into BT1 and they mate together. The joy or the benefit of that big heavy battery pack is also it lowers the CG of this vehicle. Then it comes to the electric motors, the propulsion system. You have, at least in this Edition 1, which is the most expensive variant of the Hummer EV, they're gonna have cheaper variants with less range and less power, has 3 electric motors, 1 in the front, 2 in the rear. The 2 rear motors are essentially independent of one another, but they're in one housing. The right motor, due to packaging, powers the left wheel. The left motor powers the right wheel. All 3 of these electric motors combined have a total system output of 1,000 horsepower and 11,500 foot-pounds of torque, and that's under peak conditions.
And all those motors make the same power, correct?
Yes, they're all the same size power output of one another.
And the reason they have the opposite motor in the rear powering the other wheel has to do with half shaft length and power and torque delivery through those.
And packaging. The big one is packaging. So another non-negotiable of this project was suspension travel. They brought in a lot of real racing off-road enthusiasts on their team. And they realized that because this is a EV, they didn't have to deal with the packaging compromises of an internal combustion engine. So there's like 13 inches of total suspension travel found in this vehicle. And because there's not a giant motor in the front, a giant pumpkin in the rear, they can get the control arms to go up and down and have the articulation necessary for a vehicle like this. And there's no giant center half shaft or drive shaft running through the center of this vehicle. So those 3 electric motors essentially can torque vector. So the front has torque vectoring by brake as it is a single motor, and you can choose to simulate an e-locker where it'll lock the front differential.
And it will use torque vectoring by brake when it's not in lock mode.
Yes. And then in the rear, you have 2 electric motors that can torque vector themselves. So they can individually pick how much torque they're going to send to either wheel, and it can also use the brakes to torque vector in the back. It is a very sophisticated system. And when it comes to power delivery, while they have more or less presets, so normal mode is trying to simulate 50-50. When you're on the highway to be more efficient, it'll essentially become front wheel drive. But when you're in off-road mode, it'll basically be mostly a rear bias system, or when it's in watts to freedom or WTF mode, which is their gimmicky name for sport mode or launch control mode. It's maximum power all the time, and it's going to be a rear bias system.
The interesting part about all this, and I want to just talk about it because it's one of the largest parts of engineering this, once you get all the mechanical systems together, that it becomes an insane amount of time calibrating and getting them working together. So it has to become normal inputs of what you expect from a traditional on-road vehicle, and then it has to change off-road as well. You can't have a really sharp throttle response where it's like jerking you around. It's very complicated. And the safety systems, because now everything is working on the calibrations of stability control and braking intervention. So when you turn the wheel, you think, oh, it just send the power to the rear. It's not that simple. Like, you have to smooth those motors in, which wheel is doing what, and then adding in braking to get the car to turn in. So getting that right in all pavement surfaces, because each pavement surface requires a different calibration for each of these. And it's mind-blowing how much of the software side is involved in this. Otherwise, it'd be a giant
It's all
brick.
ones and zeros.
Yeah, literally it is. But the hardware is just as important to make sure this thing is capable. and that it works and stays working as the software part of it.
This has a 329-mile range when it's fully charged, and it is an accurate 320 miles of range. We harp on EVs all the time that the range is inaccurate. I will tell you for a fact, after driving this thing for nearly 700 miles, the range is accurate. But the con of having that enormous battery, unlike something like the BZ4X, which has a mid 70 kilowatt hour battery, at over 200, this is a mother to charge.
This is the fine print of these things. It's not just the Hummer, but like to your point, every time I go to a DC fast charger, 150 kilowatt,
It's never that speed.
it's never that speed. It's always changing depending on the temperature, you know, and you're sitting there a long time, and then you see the other people. If there's a wait, and after a while, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm spending $100,000+ on a lot of these like luxury EV products. I can't get out of there. Time is money. If you have this kind of money, I don't want to be wasting 30 minutes to an hour in this thing. Could take you even longer than that. And then if you have to wait, you know, it's the problem with
The
this.
infrastructure still is a
Yes.
legitimate issue, as amazing as this is. The next thing, though, Mark, because we could beat a dead horse with that, is the chassis.
Yeah.
This is an over 9,000-pound truck. Once you incorporate what little fluids there are, the body structure and the battery pack, and you max one of these things out, they're over 9,000 pounds. So the chassis, the suspension architecture, had to deal with that. So it's essentially multi-link front and rear. You have giant wishbones in the front, giant wishbones in the rear. And again, you have an enormous amount of suspension travel, but they had to institute some of the biggest air shocks and air springs I've ever seen in my entire life. And who makes those, Mark?
So you have ZF dampers. They're adaptive dampers that can change rates based on drive mode and condition. And the air springs are vibroacoustic units. And those spring rates for the air ride stays consistent among the drive modes. It's not constantly adjusting itself. But the big thing with the air ride is its flexibility of changing its ride height for the conditions. Because this is so enormous, if you want to go flat up, because that's part of the EV experience, right? That theme park like straight line acceleration, you don't want this thing 50 feet in the air because it becomes unstable. So it's able to adjust itself to promote on-road, better aerodynamics, keeping that center of gravity as low as possible for efficiency, and then it can raise itself up for things like off-roading, ground clearance, or rock crawling for articulation. You know, if it starts to get stuck on one end and lifting itself or getting caught on one corner, yes, you have torque vectoring with the electric motor independence, but its ability to raise or lower itself in those corners can be the difference between getting stuck and unstuck. And it's this combination of all these things that it does is why this is so flexible in terms of a road vehicle.
The amount of suspension travel is enormous, and the ability for this thing to raise itself. From its normal drive mode, it can raise itself into what they call extract suspension mode to 6 inches, and it is a comical amount of wheel and suspension travel at that point. And then when you go to watts to freedom, it'll lower itself. The other part of the chassis dynamics is the steering, specifically the rear steer. We joked off camera that essentially it's like there are 2 steering racks in this vehicle.
Yeah.
In something like a GT3, which, you know, basically all 911s have rear steering now,
Yeah.
it's 2 little motors on the left and the right.
Yeah.
This is one essentially giant steering rack being threaded through the rear electric motors.
It's got real toe arms and ball joints in the rear, so it's a separate steering box in the back to give you that level of articulation, and that's the magic.
10 degrees.
It's crazy when you see it, and I'll show you some of the drone footage here of, you know, how tight this turning radius is, and I shit you not, it is like that of a small vehicle, like a compact car. And it's the magic of what this system can do to reduce the size of this beastly proportions, which we'll talk about in the drive in a bit. I think the other part with the steering system is you don't have a variable rate steering rack in the front. It's a consistent ratio. The rear steer, however, does have an adjustable ratio based on your conditions.
But with that, Mark, I know we've talked for a very long time at this point, and there's more to talk about when we do the Hummer SUV. We should take this for a quick drive.
Sounds good, Jack. Oh, Christ. I've had to hear about this car for 2 weeks.
Hey, Mark, Hummer, what's the freedom? Do you have any doggy daycares I own, Mark?
Oh, my prostate.
Oh, Mark, you know the best thing about this thing? I can do it more than once in a row.
Oh, please don't. Please don't.
We're in WTF mode, also known as watts to freedom. This thing is VMAX to 105 miles an hour. Not that you'd be wanting to go much faster in a 9,000 pound truck SUV thing. But what I'm going to say is once you take this out of watts to freedom, which might as well be sport mode, and you put this back into normal, and it raises itself back up off the ground, it is a extraordinarily normal feeling luxury truck.
So, you know, we've had a pretty lengthy discussion about this in the shop. You know, I'm not going to get into the technical part, but when you're buying this, this is an experience. You called this like an Epcot ride, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is as a truck. The experience is much different than anything else I've ever been in. I don't know. I think for the people, the demographic, the doggy daycare owner demographic, and then some, probably the people in my generation that have extra money, like they drive around with Dr. Feelgood on loop. There's a lot to like about this. This is a very, very complicated product that translates extremely well to driving on the street. I thought it would be a total piece of shit. I thought it would ride horrible is what I mean. I thought it would be noisy, like just a kind of a trash can feeling on the inside. Tell me about your experience with it.
So I have put quite a few miles on this thing, driving it around, you know, filming this, talking to all the engineers, and I've experienced it everywhere other than really hardcore off-road, because we live in Illinois. No one can off-road this out here, not really at least.
Yeah.
But as a, let's call it weekend fun toy, right? That's really what this is replacing. This is almost like a sports car, but for truck people. We talked about the TRX and the Raptor R sort of in that same vein.
Yeah.
It does an amazing job at feeling very special when you need it to, as far as like all the gimmicks, watts to freedom, the crab walk, how high you can raise this thing, the fact that you can make it a true convertible. It does all of that very well. But when you're just putting around in this thing, hopefully you're going to use this as a daily, something to take you to work. It's really quiet for the most part. It's really comfortable. Yes, there's some wind noise, but once you're, say, below 50 miles an hour, if it's not really windy out, it's near luxury SUV levels of quiet because the body is so rigid.
Yeah.
It rides exceptionally well, and it doesn't feel like this huge house. When I had you drive it, you noted that the rear steer in this thing, you know, yes, you don't feel anything in this vehicle whatsoever. You don't in any truck. Does a good job dramatically shrinking this down to where it doesn't feel cumbersome. It always feels wide. There's nothing they can do about that.
Right.
But in the corners, you don't feel like you're like, oh my God, I'm going to fly off the road like you do in some of the other trucks. It's really impressive.
Well, when you have a steering box in the back like they do, I mean, this takes something that would be otherwise like almost unusable in any small area or, you know, tight city areas. And while, yes, it helps you off-road, this makes it a far more normal, livable SUV or truck thing on the everyday commute, because you can like pull any maneuver that you could in a small car. The turning radius is incredible. The overall, you know, maneuverability is surprisingly good. The problem that I have with it is it has the same problem as a sports car. Like you get into something fast, it takes so much restraint not to be an asshole in fast cars where you want to go sideways, you want to go fast all the time. I drove this and I thought to myself, I just want to go out there. I literally just want to drive off the road, drive over curbs to be a complete asshole and do stupid stuff with it because it's so insanely capable. I hope that the owners, the limited amount of people that are going to have this, are going to get to experience really going off-road like you should. Because you feel nothing and it can do everything in all conditions. Like that's what they designed this for. It's nuts.
I think one of the things I appreciate about this is that I know the engineers, like you remove them out of the marketing video, you talk to them, they are surprisingly not self-serious, right?
Yeah.
They acknowledge what they're building is basically a theme park ride for people who want to bring out their inner 10-year-old. And hopefully if you buy this thing, you aren't self-serious and you see the comedy and the joy and obviously the impressive amount of engineering in this product. What I will say is, honestly, there's not a whole lot to talk about in the driving dynamics. Everything's very well calibrated. It's linear. If you blindfolded someone and you played V8 noises, you could probably fool someone that this is internal combustion.
Yeah.
It's that smooth and linear in all its inputs. But what I'm trying to get at is the technology in this truck, like the rear steer, is going to make its way into things like a Suburban or a Yukon.
Right.
And the advantages in packaging that this Ultium propulsion system has and with their suspension platform in the rear, you're going to see that in more and more vehicles to make them more maneuverable, easier to drive, feel more nimble. So this technology, as it's really just a showcase here in this Hummer, you're going to see in a lot of the GM EV products in the future, which is why at least I put so much effort into the shop segment of this, trying to explain to people that, well, yes, this is a marketing car at this point. It's very impressive. It's this flagship vehicle. You're going to hopefully see this technology make its way into regular cars that you and your significant others can actually buy and own.
Yeah. This is not something that they intended on selling, like, you know,
they're not going to sell 400,000 of
right,
these.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not what this is about. It's a technology showcase to prove that they could do it. They got it out faster than anyone else, and that it all works together. And in terms of a truck experience, it's, you know, cutting through the marketing stuff, they're trying to redefine what a truck is. And if you're coming from a regular truck, this eliminates the problems with many of them. It improves the ride quality, it improves the maneuverability, it improves the ride, like overall ride comfort part of it, and it no longer has the truckishness of the traditional body-on-frame unit. It also adds the speed that trucks never had before, and it adds the drivetrain refinement that was lost in a lot of body-on-frame trucks with a center diff, you know, the drivetrain shudder from these enormous,
mechanical systems.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't have any of that, so it's taking you to the next level. And because they've removed a lot of that out of there, this is something you can enjoy driving every day, assuming you can afford this and the charging and all the other bullshit.
You can live with the compromises of an EV truck. It still reduces the range when you tow to essentially non-usable numbers if you have to use this vehicle for work. But honestly, no one is buying a $110,000 convertible truck as a work tow vehicle. This is your sports car, truck, toy thing you use on the weekends to go have a jolly old time. So Mark, with that, I think it's time for us to wrap this video up and head into the final thoughts.
All right.
Please.
Final thoughts on the Hummer EV. Huge thanks to Castle Chevrolet and McHenry for letting us use their lift. This thing is so big, it wouldn't fit on our Ben Pack lift. We had to go to a dealer that has a commercial style lift to lift this thing, and our GM reps who gave us technical information, and especially Paige, our personal GM rep, who had to go back and forth with me on technical questions for like 40 years. I'm sorry if I've taken years off your life, Paige. So what about the Hummer EV? What do I think about this thing? As we talked about ad nauseum in the shop segment, this is essentially a technical power play for GM. They fast-tracked the hell out of this thing to get it out. And it has a lot of very impressive technology, and it honestly will probably filter down into everything they have moving forward. Everything from the way the electric architecture works with Ultium. You're going to see in things like Blazers and Equinoxes and Silverados and everything else. The way that the rear steer module works, I can guarantee will make its way into quite a few truck products to make their big vehicles feel more nimble. And that is a huge perk. And the fact that if you're going to buy a vehicle like this, you can now have 9,000-pound vehicles with smallish brakes because the electric motors will slow you down. That's one of the questions people had about this thing. How does it stop? Well, it uses the electric motors to slow down the vehicles, which is impressive. What are its cons? Well, its big con, other than its cost, it's $110,000, and by the time a dealer gets a hold of you or someone trying to resell one of these vehicles, it's $250,000, is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is still a problem, at least here in the Midwest. We had this thing in, let's call it, late March. And all we had was problems with chargers. We went to EV America stations. All the fast chargers were broken, or they throttled you down to 80 kilowatts. And when you have a 200 kilowatt hour battery, it takes a long time to charge this thing. The fast chargers, the one that exists out here in the Chicagoland area, of the 4 of them, 3 of them were broken at this EV Go station and 1 worked. And it was throttled down to 180 kilowatts, which again is half of what it's supposed to be charging and led to hilariously long charge times. And that's the problem with EV vehicles still here in the Midwest region. The infrastructure doesn't exist, and that's going to be a problem. Rear steer, the air ride, the fact that you can get a 9,000-pound vehicle to do 0 to 60 in low 3s. It's a really impressive showcase for what technology is coming in the future. So with that, thanks for watching. Again, huge thanks to all the engineers.
Hey guys, it's Jack. I like videos of myself in my Corvette on TikTok. I leave the videos looping to get more views, and it helped me land a brand deal with Imperial Margarine. Butter me this, I can use 222222222x more margarine than traditional butter and save a boatload of money. At the gym, I pass out sticks in the men's locker room after a hot shower. Subscribe to Savage Geese today and get 20% off your first stick. Hey, do it for yourself and your family. I'm doing this for you.